So as the world began the rebuilding process, we move on to the next slide here. This is what I call the golden years of the U.S. dollar system and the U.S. dollar. This is basically from the end of World War II to 1971. Throughout this era, the rest of the world needed to buy things from the United States. We were the leading producer of machinery and oil and goods that the rest of the world needed. In the system, in this case, Great Britain is buying things from us, machinery, oil. They are sending us their currency. We have the choice to hold on to their currency, or this whole system is backed by international gold exchange. So basically, we could hold on to those, pounds, the English pounds, or, internationally, we could ask for gold. Throughout this era, the United States pretty much became, whenever we had currencies, we took gold back in exchange for our things. The opposite was not true, though. In this system, the United States needed stuff from other countries. So in this case, Japan is being used as the example. Japan, by the 1950s, started, into commercial, started to build things like transistor radios and other things people in the United States needed. We would pay for those things with U.S. dollars. Japan is now sitting on these U.S. dollars. They ship real things to us. But at this point, the United States is still by far the biggest exporting nation. If you could see charts, I don't have them here. But at this point, the amount that the United States is exporting to other countries compared to what we're importing is, there's a huge discrepancy, which is ultimately good for the United States. That means our products are in demand, our people are getting paid, very well throughout this period, and our currency continues to get more and more attractive to other countries. So in this scenario, Japan could ask for gold in exchange for its dollars that it's now sitting on, but they decide not to, and most countries do not decide to ask for gold in exchange. The reason being is that the U.S. dollar throughout this period continues to go up in value. Remember what's happening during this period where the United States is fighting the Cold War and Vietnam and Korea. And you also have, the Johnson Great Society and all the social spending that's going on during this time. This is causing huge, in comparison maybe to World War II, not as large, but every year the United States is running budget deficits. That has to be covered somehow. So what happens is instead of asking for gold back, which really gives them no return, they decide to buy U.S. debt or U.S. treasuries. Excuse me. So Japan buys, U.S. debt, and they make 4 or 4.5% interest, or whatever it is they were making at that time. That gives them more dollars to spend in the future. So as they accumulate dollars over here, and they're not, they can't spend it all on anything. They don't want the gold, so for the future, they start buying U.S. debt. On this side of the ledger, though, the U.S. side, this is very short-sighted, in my opinion at least. I think history has borne that to be true, is that the United States was basically buying, was spending itself into the future through the use of government debt. It was facilitated. Most other countries can't do what we're doing. The United States can overspend whenever it wants to, so long as it can find a buyer for its debt, out in the market. This whole system revolves around the U.S. dollar, keeping the U.S. dollar constantly in demand. The U.S. can overspend whenever it wants to. That is the secret to the U.S. system. At this point, it's not quite as big of an advantage. Actually, it might actually be somewhat of a disadvantage. The U.S. is sending real stuff out to the world. In exchange, we're getting their money and we're getting their gold, but at the same time, we're building up their manufacturing capacity, which allows them to compete with us. There was a lot of good reasons as to why they thought this was a good idea, but I think ultimately it turned out to be wrong. So what we're looking at here is a chart of spending versus gross domestic product. This is government spending. excuse me, what you see is 1940 is the far left here, and what you see is coming out of the Great Depression, what is considered the end of the Great Depression. You can see how far down government spending is. So, the comparison as to what we ended up spending in World War II, that ultimately was what got us out of the Depression. The amount of employment that was created by war spending. If you were to follow this, I think the line kind of goes off like this. So, this is government debt created. Prior to World War II and the Bretton Woods Accords, the United States had to fund their deficits, by getting real people to come in, and usually it was funded by people in the United States buying treasury bonds, and if you remember the war bond movements and whatnot. This all had to be funded the old-fashioned way. So basically, the government gets to overspend after World War II and the Bretton Woods agreements. Instead of taxing U.S. citizens or even, relying upon, internal people buying U.S. debts, they have to start looking outward. We're not taxing the U.S. citizen enough to cover all the government spending. So basically, if we move on here, all of this spending, all of this constantly buying forward by the U.S. government, if we keep moving forward, Korea, Cold War, all the build-up to fight the Soviet Union and Vietnam, and all the spending throughout the 1960s, basically leads us to 1971. You'll never hear it called this way in the U.S. history books, but it is basically the time of the first U.S. bankruptcy and Nixon closing the gold window. Remember, I told you international trade was based upon gold being traded between countries. Gold came to the United States. Gold rarely left the United States up to this point. This changed throughout the 1960s, but it came to a head in 1971. And historically, it's called the closing of the gold window by Nixon.